Joining me now is First Nations children's advocate Cindy Blackstock. Cindy, thanks for being with us. Before we get into what the government is or isn't doing, can you tell us a little bit about what the problem is? What kind of challenges are kids on reserves, especially remote ones, facing right now?
You know, what a lot of viewers may not know is that the federal government funds public services for kids on reserve, everything from education to healthcare and child welfare, whereas the provinces fund it for everyone else. And you know what, Bashi, going back at least 110 years ago, Canada was made aware of how their underfunding of these services was actually leading to the unnecessary deaths of children in residential schools. Now, we know more recently from Auditor General's reports that those inequalities continue across every area of First Nations children's experience. They get less funding because they're on reserve and they're First Nations kids. And last year, of course, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled that that is racial discrimination by the federal government, and they ordered them to stop, but unfortunately they have not.
So let's get in a bit more detail. What exactly did that decision tell the government that it had to do?
It said that it needed to immediately stop the racial discrimination that was for the underfunding of child welfare, because what the tribunal found is that really Canada's underfunding of family support services to keep families together, especially as they're trying to recover from the multi-generational impacts of residential schools, the underfunding of that was meaning that families weren't getting a fair shake and more kids were going unnecessarily into child welfare care. In fact, 3 times as many First Nations kids are in foster care now than in residential schools. And the tribunal said that's widening the harm for First Nations children from residential schools, not narrowing it. The second thing the tribunal said is the federal government is discriminating by not allowing First Nations children to have the same access to public services that every other child enjoys. It's something called Jordan's Principle. And what it's supposed to mean is that First Nations kids can access them on the same terms as other kids. And they were to immediately implement that, but they haven't. And we've seen one tragedy after another unfold because the kids' childhoods are being negatively affected as the government doesn't comply with the order.
Further to that, what's your overall assessment of what they have or haven't done so far beyond, the Jordan's Principle, beyond, to do with the whole ruling, I guess?
The compliance has been really piecemeal, and in fact, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has issued 2 non-compliance orders against the federal government because it's not fully meeting the order, and there is more hearings in March. And you know what's so frustrating is I hear government officials say, well, you need to be patient with us. Well, first of all, they've known about these inequalities for 110 years. But the second thing is I wonder if they ever think about what patient means, which is to suffer without complaining. That's really what the derivative of the word patience is. And First Nations children have been suffering for generations. And I think it's time for the federal government to do exactly what it knows it should do, which is immediately invest at least $155 million into the child welfare system to help increase the support services so First Nations children have a better chance of staying at home. And the second is fully comply with Jordan's Principle, because we saw the tragedy of how that actually connects with the deaths of those poor young children up in Northern Ontario just last week. Just to make it clear for your viewers, in Ontario, it is the law that all children get access to mental health services under the child welfare law. The federal government knows it doesn't fund that for First Nations kids, so the kids who are arguably the most in need are not getting the services. They were ordered to provide those services. They didn't. They said they'd only discuss providing them. And then we had the First Nation in July saying, oh my gosh, we've heard about a youth suicide pact. Please fund some mental health services for our community. The federal government still didn't do it. And then we had 2 deaths of 12-year-olds by suicide just last week. And then when the government hears about this tragedy, it says, well, the request from the community came at an awkward time in the budget cycle. So it's not an over-exaggeration to say that the government's conduct is really putting children in situations where they're far more likely to die. And I think this is going to be shocking news to many Canadians, that in 2017, while we're spending $500 million on Canada's birthday party, that the federal government is not moving heaven and earth to make sure that these kids are safe, that they have the same access to services that other Canadian children get, and that we finally put an end to Canada's long history of discrimination towards First Nations kids. That would be a great gift for Canada's 150th, but so far, it doesn't look like it's coming.
I know the government says that they are injecting, for example, $382 million over the next 3 years, but I also remember interviewing you a year and a half ago when they got into office, and you had a lot of optimism and hope because of the emphasis they had placed on rebuilding the relationship with First Nations. How does it feel for you, as someone who's been an advocate for so many decades, to watch these suicides happen, to see these statements from ministers at this point? How does it feel for you? We don't have very long left, but how do you feel?
Absolutely heartbreaking. Like, I feel like I have failed these kids. I don't know how the government feels, but I feel like we've all failed these kids. And you know, the government makes that announcement about the $382 million, but in the court documents, under a sworn oath just 2 days ago, they admit that it was only $11 million that they've spent, not $382 million. So I think they need to stop treating this as a public relations exercise and do what every caring Canadian expects them to do, and that is to get out there